The message arrived like a sealed envelope dropped at my feet. 3 lines, no explanation, no negotiation. My mother's name at the top, then, because of everything that's come to light, please don't come by the villa until this is resolved. That was all. The screen went dark. I sat with the brightness of that sentence and understood, in the same breath, both the sting of exclusion and the beginning of an obligation I could not ignore. Being told to stay away from a place you grew up in is not, by itself, a story worth filming. What made it into one was what I found next. The villa wasn't merely walls and family photographs. It was the headquarters of a charity that, on paper, told a different story than the one the ledgers wrote. The exclusion was small and personal. The discrepancy in the books was public and consequential. One thing pushed me into the other. I remember the first night I pulled the ledger out from under a stack of event invoices. The numbers were neat, rounded, plausible, until they weren't. Deposits listed that had no matching bank slips. Payments made to vendors with no contracts. Invoices that duplicated amounts across months like echoes. At first I told myself mistakes happen, then the numbers multiplied. Then the story they suggested became impossible to ignore. Funds meant for programs were drifting into channels that had no clear beneficiaries. The moral weight of that discovery was immediate. It is one thing to find an error, and another to suspect wrong. It is another again to suspect someone you respect. For years, a family member had been a mentor to many of us, a steady presence in meetings, the person people deferred to at board dinners. The ledger's trail, tentative at first, began to point toward that very figure. I felt a pressing private question. How do you confront a person who taught you how to do the right thing when the evidence suggests they did otherwise? I chose deliberately not to panic. I photographed receipts, made copies, created a digital folder with dates and line items. I wrote notes in the margins of invoices, the kind of careful annotation that makes messy paper behave like testimony. There was no melodrama in the work. There was only the slow accumulation of facts one by one, like stacking stones to cross a stream. Then I called Kate. She is not a person who grandstands. She reads statutes the way other people read novels, attentive to detail, resistant to flourish. She listened, asked precise questions, and asked me to bring everything in. Miss Reynolds, our assistant, organized the packets. She placed them in envelopes and labeled them with a restrained efficiency that felt like prayer. When we handed everything over to counsel, the act felt less like betrayal and more like a civic duty. We were not a watchdog show. We were people doing the procedural work of accountability. There is an uglier myth that accountability must be loud and punitive. We avoided that. We cooperated with investigators. We asked for oversight, not spectacle. Federal agents moved methodically through records and interviews. At one point, an external authority placed travel restrictions and other measures on a person implicated in the irregularities. That language, restricted movement pending hearings, was precise and careful, because precision is the only protection against rumor. I said nothing about guilt or innocence. The law was engaged and would do its work. If discovery is what opens a wound, then the decision that followed was its dressing. The letter from my mother, short, flat, exclusionary, did not cause me to act out of spite. It focused me. I saw how privilege could be turned away from harm or toward repair. If family infrastructure had, in part, been the vehicle for misdirected resources, then reclaiming that infrastructure for the public good was a proportional response. I did not set out to demolish a legacy. I set out to reassign it. The transaction itself looked, to an observer, like a long exercise in patience. Open escrow, secure estimates, arrange signatures across state lines. We built commitments directly into the purchase documents, clauses that required background checks for staff, mandatory monthly financial reporting to an independent oversight board, and programmatic covenants binding the property to serve children impacted by the misappropriation. Ownership would not simply change names on a deed, It would codify the purpose of the property. The day I signed was quiet in a way that surprised me. There was a small vertigo, an awareness that a pen could pivot history, and under that, a steady calm. I remember the pen's weight, the scratch as it crossed the signature line, and the way a stamped envelope seemed suddenly heavier. Those small, tactile moments grounded me. They were proof that choices are administrative acts as much as moral ones. When the final page read sold, Beloff Resort, every parcel, it felt neither like conquest nor punishment. It felt like a new responsibility. After the purchase, the work became intensely bureaucratic in the best possible sense. We had to translate intent into procedures. Contracts with staff outlined trauma-informed care standards. Room usage schedules prioritized therapy hours and staff rotations. We rewired the staffing model so that many of the people who had kept the villa running, housekeepers, groundskeepers, kitchen leads, could transition into paid roles within the new program if they chose. Miss Reynolds organized orientation packets that were practical and humane. They included anonymized protocols for intake, consent forms reviewed by independent counsel, and a simple, transparent governance checklist, monthly reports, independent audits, community advisory board meetings. There was resistance, predictably. Victoria, my sister, circulated an op-ed draft that read like a plea and an accusation. Why weaponize family assets in public? Another cousin, sharply defensive, called late at night. My father read the notice in silence, his face a map of confusion and grief. Uncle Robert, who had been a mentor to many and who appears in the ledger trail, reacted with denial and then with a quieter anger when restrictions were applied. I expected rage. What unsettled me was the private grief in my mother's eyes when she brought bags of warm food to the staff break room on a day when contractors were installing ramps by the west entrance. She was trying in her own way to bridge a distance she felt powerless to cross. Delivery day at the resort was intentionally procedural. I arrived early when the ocean was glass, and the light turned the stucco to milk. The bell desk smelled of lemon disinfectant and old linen. Notices were placed in sealed folders and handed to the manager, Elisa, whose composure has always been a form of accountability. She read the new ownership statement aloud at the front desk in a voice neither triumphant nor ashamed, only clear. The words themselves were legal and unadorned: change of ownership, new access protocols, reassignments for programmatic use, transitional accommodations for certain family members. The power of that moment was not in volume, but in the fact of the paper itself. Procedure carried the weight where spectacle would have been hollow. There were faces in the lobby that morning that told the story better than any headline. My father's hands clapped the edge of a folding chair as he listened. Victoria's mouth tightened. Uncle Robert's jaw worked like someone learning to chew grief. Some argued, some fled. I handed packets with alternative housing details for relatives who were displaced by the change in access rights. We did not want to make people homeless. We wanted to reroute privilege into obligation. An external agency, working with the paperwork we had provided, opened further lines of inquiry. I cooperated fully. The role of investigators in this story is procedural, neutral, patient, exacting. Where I might have been tempted to paint them as angels or adversaries, the reality was more mundane and necessary. They catalogued, questioned, and archived. When measures were taken, travel limitations, restrictions on movement for a person named in the records, the phrasing was careful because justice itself is careful. Transforming the resort was the most tactile part of the work. We took rooms that had once been decorated to flatter guests and repurposed them for therapy and rest. A ballroom became a movement room for art and play therapy. A wing of suites became family respite rooms where caregivers could sleep while their children received day services. We installed accessible ramps and widened doorways. Carpeted corridors were replaced, where appropriate, with tactile flooring for children with sensory needs. We planted a sensory garden with paths that curve like questions and bench alcoves that invite low, private talk. The chandelier in the former dining room was lowered and wrapped with soft fabric to cut glare for overstimulated visitors. The marble staircase remained as a memory of the place's history, but at its base we placed benches where parents could sit and learn short practices for breathing and grounding. Staff training was not cosmetic. We formed partnerships with pediatric therapists and regional clinics. We recruited people with both clinical experience and the kind of patients many nonprofits undervalue: the ability to sit with a child who is afraid and not rush the healing. Background checks were thorough. Council reviewed our intake protocols. We also built a governance model that required monthly anonymized reports to be published online and shared with an independent oversight board. Donors would see not glossy before and after shots, but line items and impact measures: number of families served, hours of therapy provided, percentage of staff who completed trauma-informed care training. Transparency was not a perfunctory gesture. It was the scaffold that made the program defensible against both scandal and mission drift. The first day children arrived was small and tender, and infinitely loud in all the right ways. The soundscape shifted. Where there had been careful footsteps on marble and the muffled clink of crystal, there came instead the scatter of small shoes, the bright, unpredictable staccato of laughter, the shuffle of a paper boat pushed along the fountain's edge. The paper rustle that had once signified invoices and ledgers now accompanied snack time paperwork and consent forms. It became its own motif, a sound that migrated from suspicion to stewardship. We witnessed simple acts that felt, in their quiet way, like proof. A child who would not let anyone near their hand took over a week to releasing it to a therapist during a game. A caregiver slept for the first time in months while their child attended a day program. One child spent 20 minutes meticulously folding a paper boat and then set it afloat in the fountain, watching it move around and around like the small hope it was. Those moments did not erase harm. They did not promise a smooth future. They were, however, concrete evidence that repurposing space and resources enabled something restorative to begin. The program's first 6 months demanded constant tending. We published anonymized impact reports. We invited independent auditors to review finances. We set up a community advisory board comprised of local clinicians, child advocates, and people with lived experience of the issues the program sought to address. We answered questions from donors about sustainability, and we adjusted our model when the data suggested it. For instance, the demand for respite hours outstripped our initial projections, so we reallocated funds from capital improvements to staffing for a season. The decision was not dramatic. It was governed by a spreadsheet and by the visible signs of need. Family life did not knot into tidy resolution. Some relatives continued to write op-eds and letters. Victoria's piece ran and required a public response that was sober and procedural. Other gestures were small and human. A neighbor dropping off casseroles, a mother who, ashamed and tentative, brought a tray of pastries to the caregiving staff and asked only that her name not be printed in any newsletter. Those acts complicated the binary of villain and victim. They demanded that we remain humane in our governance, even when we were firm in our accountability. There were risks, of course. Any act that repurposes private wealth for public good invites skepticism about motives. Some accused me of using a family dispute for publicity. That was never the intent. The response was procedural: show the contracts, open the audits, publish the governance board minutes. Transparency is the antidote to suspicion. We embraced it because it is both good stewardship and practical politics. Other risks were ethical. Working with children in trauma requires humility. We refused quick narratives of triumph. We emphasized that the program's measures would show incremental changes: more caregiver sleep, increased participation in therapeutic activities, small shifts in behavior. We were careful in our language. No promises of cure, only commitments to provide sustained, evidence-informed support. When we spoke of outcomes in the reports, we used phrases like opened space for, provided access to, and helped facilitate, because language shapes expectation. There was one image that kept returning to me, one small emblem of the work, a paper boat circling the fountain at dusk. I watched a child tend it with hands that were careful and deliberative: fold, crease, set, watch. The boat did not fix everything. It did not rewrite history. But it provided a place to practice trust in motion. The fountain, once ornamental, now carried play and small ceremony. It was a modest, human sign that ownership can be converted into service. The moral of this story is not that assets are a cure. Ownership by itself does not undo harm. What ownership can do is create a space where restitution is possible. We paired procedural rigor, contracts, audits, oversight, with a clear ethical aim to transform privilege into a tool for repair. That was not theatrical justice. It was a sustained, bureaucratic kind of care. If you are watching this and want to follow similar stories of private reckoning turned public good, consider subscribing. There are more accounts of how accountability and structure can make repair possible. In the end, the family fracture remains complex. Some relationships are mended slowly, others are quiet or distant. I hold no illusions that a change of ownership heals every wound. What I do believe is this: when evidence suggests a wrong, when power has been used in ways that harm, there is a responsibility that extends beyond private shame. It is the responsibility to translate privilege into service, to make sure that the places we once reserved for ourselves can instead become places where repair is practiced. Months after the first children arrived, I stood by the fountain at sunset while a small hand nudged a paper boat. The ocean beyond the property was glass, pulling the light of the last day into a broad, soft band. Laughter folded into the air. I thought about the ledger that had started all of this, and the slow, dull rustle of paper that had once felt like gossip. Now that rustle sounded different. Forms being signed, consent given, reports published. The same sound had moved from accusation to accountability. If you want to read the anonymized impact report we publish monthly, or to learn about vetted organizations that partner with programs like ours, there are links in the description. If this account raises questions about how privilege can be redirected toward restitution, I hope it gives a small model for what that might look like. Meticulous documentation, legal prudence, ethical design in contracts, transparent governance, and a patient commitment to care. I did not acquire an entire resort to punish anyone. I acquired it to make room. The paper changed hands. The fountain now carries more paper boats than invoices. That is not a finishing note. It is an invitation to hold systems to account with dignity, to repurpose what was private into something public, and to be patient about the work of repair.